The last text I sent him, if you don't respond, I'm going to the police. And he didn't respond. And so I went to the police and I posted a picture of him in his car on social media, and people were sharing it. And then that evening, or that early morning, about 4 o'clock in the morning, I had my phone next to my head, and it was the Alaska State Troopers outside my house. And so I went to the door, opened it, and I was half asleep. And it was the state trooper that I later, because I was so half asleep, I later found out that it was the trooper that had arrested me and built a case against me 10 years prior. And he was sitting there asking me questions for about a half an hour, saying, okay, when's the last time you saw your son? What was he doing? You know, who I thought he was there to get information about the report that I had given, the Palmer Police Department. And 30 minutes into the conversation, he said, well, we found your son's car, and my heart sank. I was like, okay, did you find my son? And he said, yes. And I was like, is he okay? And he said, no, he's deceased. And I instantly was like, I can't even explain it. It's like it's like your whole life. It's like, is he really saying this? I was trying to really wrap my head around the fact that my son was gone. And I was like, he's diabetic. Was it his diabetes he was using? Did he overdose? And he said, no, it was a suspicious death. And he really didn't give me details. But when he said suspicious, I knew instantly that he'd been murdered. And that's when I told the trooper that you need to look into maybe who he was talking to, because I know that he was involved with drugs. And I instantly knew when he told me it wasn't, his diabetes or that he overdosed, that somebody had killed him over drugs. So since then, I was an advocate for people, helping people out of prison. I started following up ministries in the Damascus house. I worked with whatever I could. We didn't have funding, but I tried to, get people housed that were coming out of prison. And then, giving emphasis on recovery and all that stuff. But when my son died, that's when I really said enough was enough. And that's when I started really getting out in the public without shame and saying, I'm in recovery and my son was killed from due to his addiction. And, we really need to start looking at how we're going to start addressing this opioid epidemic and people not getting access to services, but also, by this time I really didn't know who had killed my son, but I knew that I wanted to know who it was and what their story was. So I know I'm rambling, sorry.
No, I think that a question that comes to my mind is, something that came to my mind is how amazing it is that, and maybe you had this little block of time where you felt this way, but my first thing was, it's amazing that you didn't go back into drugs at that time, because that's many times what's going to make someone relapse. But then also that you wanted to know this person's story. Was there kind of did you want revenge at all, or did you go right to, what was your thought process when thinking about who hurt your son or who murdered your son?
Well, there's two sides to that. My flesh wanted to get revenge, but my heart and my relationship with God told me that I can't. And I had a deep a deep conviction, but also like I felt like God was like, and again, I cannot explain it, but I was like, how am I even getting through this? Because in my mind, I always thought, that if anything ever happened to my son, I would be undone, completely undone. And there's a saying, you don't know how strong you are until strong is all you got. And that's all I had. And I had the first thought that came to my mind, people were really afraid that I was going to relapse and go back to doing what I was doing. But that was the furthest thing from mine. And something that I had trained myself to do is when I had these things come up in my life that it did not, that didn't feel good or that was hard. It's especially this situation with the death of my son, and not just the death of my son, but the fact that he was murdered, was that I needed to like remind myself that I could not have a victim mentality, because having a victim mentality would send me back to and give me a reason to have an excuse. And excuses are a lot of the reasons why people end up relapsing. And so that was not going to be my excuse. That I had made it a point that I needed to understand that, something that I learned in, as hard as RSAT was, because I did the old one, and thank God they stopped that type of program. But something that I did learn in there was that victim stance was the biggest reason why I had my addiction in the first place, because I made an excuse of why I had a right to be using drugs. And so I had to like completely take that thought out of my mind and know that relapse was not an option on my list, and that I was not going to make myself a victim in this situation, but that I was going to be a victor, but also like try to make some change and make some sense out of my son's murder, but also that I did not want to make his death in vain. And then I knew in my mind that that's not what my son would have wanted me to do anyway. I wanted to honor that conversation I had when he was 16. I did not want to go backwards. And so my thought was that the first thought that I had was obviously, yeah, I mean, I wanted to slap the person that did it. I, punch them. I mean, that was my flesh wanting to do that. But like I said, I just could not, God just was like, no, I want you to forgive the person that did this, and not because, he wasn't diminishing my pain, but that I heard him say that he was going to carry me through that, and in my obedience to him. And so it was super important to me because I really like, because I've been in the pit and I know how far I've come. I really like I know that God's real, and I know where he brought me out of. And I did not want to have any form of like separation or going down into despair. So the first thing that I ran to was not the dope sack, but God. And I got down on my face, and I was just like, you gotta like help me through this. So, and it was like, in scripture, it says that, he understands what we're going through. And it was like, he gave me his compassion for the person that killed my son, even though I didn't know who had done it. It's so weird. I just can't explain it. I like, while everybody else was like, when I did find out, everybody's like, oh my God, that guy is a dirt bag. They hated him for me. And I was like, you can't. I mean, no, you cannot touch him. And God had told me that he had a plan, and it was like, I wanted to like follow through with that, and that's when I started learning about what restorative justice. I didn't know what the term was as far as like the world, but then that's when I understood, I understood scripture and I understood the justice of God, but I understand the terminology. You know what I mean? I just knew that I was, in God's eyes, I was no better than anybody, and that I needed to like remain humble myself. So
yeah, that's where grace, that's where grace comes from. Is many people, I'm sure, thought you were a little bit crazy to be willing to do then what you did, and not harbor wanting to get exact revenge. Especially, you could have. And yeah, it speaks a lot about you, but, and I know you'll understand this, to me it speaks a lot to you as your relationship to God, not to you as your own standalone person, because we're we're not much just standalone.
right, exactly.
But it speaks to the relationship with God that you had, so that's pretty incredible. I'm curious, were you, now you have a husband, you're married, were you married before or after the death of your son?
So I've known Carl since like the 90s. I vaguely remember him, but I was so strung out on drugs when he knew me, that, and doing, running escort service and just running and gunning, you know what I mean? But parts of my life was just like in pieces. I was reunited with him when a mutual friend of ours reached out to me, asked me if I would help him with some housing because he was getting out of jail and he didn't have a place to go. And so that's how we were reunited. And then when I did help him, I was targeted by certain staff that work within the probation office. They tried to have me arrested for contact with a felon, and they stalked me on Facebook. And I, of course, got super scared. I was like, why are they going to get me in trouble for getting him housed? And then I realized, I don't need to worry about that because my probation officer gave me permission. My parole officer was referring people to me and actually advocated or approved somebody that had violated their parole to be released to my house on ankle monitor while I'm still on parole myself. So I was like, okay, I don't need to worry about this because I'm not doing anything wrong, right? So, and I was being genuine in my, my steps and my parole. And so I just, when I did finally help Carl, he didn't last very long. I remember picking him up at Partners Reentry Center to take him to the transitional house, and he was shaking, like his hands were shaking. He could barely hold a pen. He sat in Partners Reentry Center for about an hour in the office and cried. He was like having an emotional breakdown. And then I got him in my vehicle and I took him to the probation office so he could fill it out. And that's when all that stuff where they were trying to get me in trouble, my PO was like, no, I gave her permission. But when I took him to the transitional house, he hyperventilated. I had to like take him out of one room and put him in the main building. He was like holding on to the side of the bed, trying to take breaths. And I was like, what's going on? He was like, I just got released from solitary confinement after spending 3 years in solitary. And he's like, this is just really overwhelming to me. And I was just like, 3 years? And it was just like, I could not wrap my head. I've been in solitary 30 days. I was losing my mind. But 3 years, I was like, So I just was like trying to encourage him, and within 2 days he relapsed. He was already running, and I tried my best to get him to turn himself in. And Carl, when he uses, it's like it's really hard to get through to him. So he ended up getting arrested 18 days later, and then he finally called me, and was like, I'm sorry. And then I was like, okay, well, just keep calling me, and we'll just, I'll help you do what you need to do. And over time, we just developed a relationship, and then we fell in love with each other. But he said that he wanted to be in a relationship with me, and I was like, I was like, I'm not the girl you knew back in the day. First of all, I am not going to be in a relationship with somebody that's an active gang leader. And secondly, if you ain't got Jesus in your life, it's a no-go. So that's where he like made a decision that he's gonna retire. And he thought that, his homies were gonna support that. And at first they did, and then he started going to church. But later he later admitted that it said that he was going to go to church just to kind of like thinking that he was, doing the gaming a little bit. But then he like was slapped with the Holy Spirit and really started taking in, what he was, he'd go to church, and then he'd also talk to the pastors and stuff like that. And so over time, he's developed, he's had a couple trip ups and stuff like that. But other than that, he's been genuine about his change, and now it's just like no holding him back. So we've been together 7 years, and we'll be married 4.
So he definitely had ties to people that could have gotten you revenge, if that's what you'd been after. So yeah, that's
even him,
yeah.
When he was baby Christian, he had that, his pride, and over time he said that when he read an article that he realized what type of person I was, and how it like humbled him reading an article after he'd been arrested, that I didn't want revenge, and I just wanted the person that had killed my son to get his life together. That was really big eye opener for him. So
Violence begets violence, and usually
right.
a lot of people are fine with that. They feel like, hey, if someone wrongs me or my family, it is my right, and to some people it's my duty to go and write that. But how do you actually write it? Because it's just like, what was that family way back in the day, the Western family, there's something in the McCoys, where for years and years this feud where they're killing this part of the family, they kill this member, it's just, it doesn't fix it, and it just causes more heartache. And yet for someone, we haven't gone into yet what you actually ended up doing, but for someone to not feel like, I want to wrap my hands around and do to this person what they hurt them like they hurt me, that's pretty amazing, and goes against the grain of a lot of not just our culture, but the world's culture, really, in most of them. So so when did you find out who the person was that had murdered your son, and how?
Still to this day, I have to say, God, please do not let me get a root of bitterness. Game recognizes game, because that's what I did. My survival was manipulating rich men into giving me their money, and not having any care in the world of who I was harming or the family that was connected. It was actually on my son's birthday that he was sentenced. I had requested that he be sentenced. He was arraigned on my son's birthday, and I wanted him sentenced on my son's birthday. He said, I just want to let you know that nobody else was involved. But he didn't own it fully, And so, you know, he of course still, like, after the dialogue, he still like was relapsing, doing some manipulation stuff in the prison. And of course, you know, he would call my phone. I would accept his calls and I would tell him that you need to do this and this and this, because there was a written plan